In October of 1914, a young British naval officer named Rupert Brooke penned a poem called Peace after assisting in the evacuation of Antwerp. The poem seems to welcome war as a rite of purification. Now, like so many men who joined up in 1914, Brooke would in fact be dead by the following spring, a victim of blood poisoning while in transit to the Mediterranean theater. Now, why did he and many others anticipate the coming war so eagerly? Now, as a new century dawned, Europeans faced new social problems on top of seemingly insoluble old ones. New solutions, or at least diagnoses, a revolution in how they thought about society, the individual, the self, and sexuality and gender, and concomitant revolutions in relations between the genders and in art and culture. Now, many were uncomfortable with these challenges. To them, the coming of war seemed a blessed relief, providing a clear sense of purpose, a clear moral issue, a chance to serve, and a chance to ignore the troubling new developments at home. Now, by 1914, what was left of the Ancien Regime seemed to be crumbling everywhere. In industrial nations, the middle class was on the rise, while the old aristocracies felt increasingly threatened or marginalized. No government could make policy without the aid and advice of industrialists or financiers. Workers' parties were gaining seats in Germany and elsewhere, and the 1890s had seen a wave of anarchist violence and assassinations of heads of states. Now, at the same time, the problems of poverty and the claims of the working class remained very real and threatened those at the top. In 1911, the British Liberal Party introduced the People's Budget, designed to provide national insurance for workers. When the aristocracy in the House of Lords balked at the increase in their taxes, the government introduced the Parliament Act of 1911, effectively ending the power of the Lords to stop legislation from the Commons. Now, the fight for gender equality, in particular the vote for women, was also destroying old traditions. As capitalism became more systematic, and especially during the periods of depression in the 1870s and 1890s, many families, even in the middle class, found that they needed two incomes. By the early years of the 20th century, women's suffrage became a major issue in Britain, with violent public demonstrations. Now, the war was a great relief to those who did not want to deal with these issues. But because World War I would be a total war, women would be enlisted as nurses and factory workers. And when the war was over, women would demand the vote all the more insistently, and the British government would give in. Now, the period was also marked by religious and philosophical contentions. By the late 19th century, religion seemed to be in full retreat. Older monarchical states such as Britain and Russia still had established religions, but elsewhere in such republics as France and new monarchies including Germany and Italy, the church was disestablished. Jews remained second-class citizens in most European states. In Austria, Karl Lueger founded the Christian Socialist Party and got elected mayor of Vienna in 1895 on a program of anti-Semitism. In France, a Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus was accused in 1893 of sending French military secrets to the German embassy. But beginning in 1896, evidence emerged that Dreyfus had been framed by fellow officers. He was pardoned in 1899, and in 1905, a liberal government passed legislation to separate church and state even more profoundly. Now, even where church and state were united, there was a general waning of religious life in the 19th century. Now, among the middle and upper classes, religion came to be seen as irrational, barbaric, or even quaint. Now, German philosophers in particular questioned the notion of God. Immanuel Kant had sought to build a moral system on pure reason. Hegel and Marx argued for historical processes that, like natural ones, had nothing to do with the hand of God. Arthur Schopenhauer argued that the world was driven by either will or idea. And Friedrich Nietzsche argued for the preeminence of will. He found religion hypocritical, a series of lies purported on an unwitting and uncritical public. And he believed that, in effect, God was dead as a concept for serious discussion or as a force to give meaning to life. Now, rather, he believed that real accomplishment was possible only for the Übermensch, or Superman, an individual of supreme will and boldness, unbound by tradition or morality. Now, it's easy to see why Nietzsche is often blamed for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and the modern cult of personality. Friedrich Nietzsche eventually went mad, and at the end of the 19th century, psychologists began to probe what that meant. Now, early psychology had grown out of religion and philosophy, assuming a split between mind and body, body and soul. It further assumed that the mind was the province of rationality. Now, Sigmund Freud developed the theory of the unconscious mind, and according to Freud, the human mind is a constant battleground among subconscious forces. Now, from these theories developed the modern fields of clinical psychology and psychiatry. Now, perhaps even more important, Freud's work led to a new understanding of the human self as driven and stymied by natural forces beyond his or her complete control. Now, Albert Einstein, working in Germany just after the turn of the century, equally destabilized the view that man is the master of his universe. In 1905, he proposed the theory of relativity, which upset Newtonian certainties by arguing that mass could be converted into energy. Now, this theory would eventually make possible the atomic bomb. The more immediate implication of Einstein's theory of relativity is that the speed of light is constant, then at extreme speeds, time and space warp. They do not behave in the unchanging fashion of the Newtonian universe. Later, Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle asserted that the very act of measurement changes the thing being measured. And Niels Bohr, his atomic theory, revived an old Greek theory that matter is not solid, but composed of atoms in constant motion. Now, the greatest sociologist at the turn of the century, the Frenchman Émile Durkheim, argued that communities were fragile sets of shared values and norms, not places. When those norms broke down, for example, when an individual's economic situation forced him or her to move to a city, the result was alienation for the community, or anomie. Now, Durkheim saw anomie as very much symptomatic of modern life. It explains suicide, which is the subject of his most famous work. Now, what all this meant to the general public at the turn of the 19th century was that nothing was certain or solid. There was no fixed point from which truth could be measured accurately. Instead, everything was in constant motion and strife. Physical reminders of this included the express train, the automobile, and after 1903, the airplane. On the cultural front, by 1914, realism was evolving into modernism. The writers of the late 19th century reacted to the ideas from science and philosophy and propelled them into the general consciousness. Thomas Hardy addressed social problems and challenged old verities, including God's interest in humanity. Henry James depicted a ruthless world clothed in the delicate sensibilities and impeccable manners of the transatlantic rich. Oscar Wilde used his wit to smash social convention, as well as the popular notion that art exists to teach us a lesson. James Joyce, whose novels pioneered stream of consciousness narrative technique, attacked the verities of Irish life while exploring the internal workings of the human psyche. Marcel Proust, another deeply psychological writer, described the physical and mental life of a gentleman in the minutest detail in the 16-volume Remembrance of Things Past. Now, in painting, Impressionism, as we have seen, broke from the idea that art should portray the thing itself. Rather, art was increasingly about the point of view of the artist. Impressionists such as Renoir and Monet emphasized the momentary play of light and shade. Van Gogh invested his subjects with psychological intensity, revealing a tortured inner self. Some painters, such as the Russian boy Vasily Kandinsky, went further, eventually abandoning the portrayal of natural objects and expressing their emotions through abstract forms. Pablo Picasso explored a huge variety of approaches, exploding basic conventions and showing his subjects from many angles at once. Now, music also broke from Romanticism into modernism and then fragmentation. Wagner, the dominant composer of the 19th century after Beethoven, was also a musical revolutionary in his use of chromaticism and leitmotifs, or themes, to represent persons, things, and even the thoughts of characters. Claude Debussy explored chromaticism further, using triads to create moods, not stories, and the music equivalent of painting's impressionism. Gustav Mahler wrote 10 gigantic symphonies, each with a different answer to the meaning in life, found through a different philosophy. The New Vienna School saw the logical development of the German traditions as always moving towards greater dissonance, greater freedom from tonality. In Russia, Igor Stravinsky believed in a music that was almost pure rhythm, devoid of romantic storytelling, and celebrating raw animal energy. Now, it could be argued that the crowds that cheered the coming of war were reacting against all of these things. Many hated this new godless, themeless, sordid view of life as an animalistic struggle for raw power and existence. The irony is, of course, that the men who marched away from this society and off to what they thought was an ennobling crusade would actually end up proving Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, and others right.